Good morning, sunflowers, and welcome to Good Journeys Tarot. I'm Rosemary, and today we are here to talk about the Hanged Man in my 78 Cards in 78 Weeks project. And as always, before we get going on that, I thought I would share a few things with you. Do want to say happy insert your spring holiday here. There are about 3 or 4 going on today. And last night was the full moon in Libra, so perhaps you're recovering from your celebration or activities last night. Um, this week, I finally figured out where my copy of the Rosetta Tarot was. The post office apparently misplaced it. And finally, after 2 months, they returned it to the seller. So it'll eventually be back on its way to me again. And we'll get to talk about it. During last night's full moon, I did a tarot reading as I do sometimes. And one of the things that I keep getting from the tarot lately that I need to work on is the Four of Wands. And so I actually printed out mine and another card on the back, which I'm not going to show you yet. And this is the first card I've ever printed from my deck to use as a talisman. And I put some herbs in the middle of it. So it's more a reminder to me than anything of where I need to focus. And I keep getting the message I need to spend time with people. And I keep thinking to myself, well, duh, I know, but how do I do that? And so this is pretty much the only time I get to see people. So I'm very happy to have a guest with us today. And you all know her. We all love her. And that is Amy from Strength Reverse. Welcome.
Hello, happy Easter, everyone. I hope the Easter Bunny visited your house today.
Well, not mine, but hopefully some other people's, right? Let's see. It looks like we've got some people popping in. We've got Dancing Soul Sister and Greta and Tarot Stash. So some new faces and some returning friends. Glad to have you here with us to talk about the Hanged Man. Some weeks I have better luck getting it to stand than others, right? So this is our card. And right now we'll start with Amy and I sharing some of our favorites from our collections, as well as, those that offer some unique perspectives. I've got a few here that are pretty much like the RWS, and so I'm just going to show them real quick because they're just different themes. Like This Might Hurt, which I do love a lot of things about that depiction. And we'll talk about the arrangement of the trees later. This is from the Mystical Medleys, which is a beautiful cartoony version. And then, of course, the Ellis deck, which has its own world going on. How about you, Amy? What cards do you have that you found interesting?
I tried to pick some that were not so much like the RWS.
Mm-hmm.
Just because there are so many. I think the Hanged Man is just usually an ugly little card. So it's not very pretty. But when I saw yours, Rosemary, I thought, oh, that's actually kind of a pretty Hanged Man. So here we have the head hanging away from the body.
Okay.
I do like the Titanic tarot where we have someone kind of pointing to the sky and pointing to the water and sort of hanging there between those two worlds. And I do like the Mystical Moments Hanged Man.
Yeah.
Because she's hanging on a zipper and it's kind of unzipping this new perspective. Just her hanging on it, suspended, makes the zipper come open.
So in the thought, the foot of the hangman is tied to an ankh by a snake, and they're hanging over a pool of snakes. And I couldn't find any information about the snakes at all anywhere in any of my reading. This is the Arcana Iris Sakura, which is a Thoth deck. But other decks seem to pick it up that, and to me, fall somewhere between Smith, Wade, and RWS. But they picked up on that snake, and so have you come across anything in your reading about the snake?
I haven't, and a lot of my cards have water in them, but not a snake.
And that's something that I think is important, and you don't see it in a lot of cards. It's not in most of the cards I just showed. It is in the Light Seers deck, which takes a more modern approach, that kind of hanging from a ribbon over the water idea. There is water in the Numinous Tarot. I do love this depiction. This little house in the tree is a little distracting to me because I don't know what its purpose is other than to be pretty, but it's a really nice card. Let's see. So this is a Tarot de Marseille deck. So the difference between this one and this one, which I mentioned earlier, is how the trees arranged. And we see that in different decks. Like some decks, they're intentional about making, whoops, wrong hand, the tree grow this way, which they say symbolizes Tav or Tau, which is associated with the world, i.e. the great work. Which this is a precursor to and an important part of. And then you have others that are shaped like the T, like a cross. And there's speculation that, okay, this is the representation of Toph, but it's an older representation. Or that, he's using the Greek letter versus the Hebrew letter.
Okay.
The other that I found is that it's the bottom of the Ankh.
Oh,
so in the Thoth, you see them hanging from the Ankh reversed, representing that idea of a different perspective. And then in this one, you only see the bottom because we've not completed that full image yet. So that's why we see so much variance in those that try to arrange their trees specifically. So here are some that are just people on trees, and there's sometimes you get the idea of death in the Hanged Man, which if you read in Waite's version, you find that that's not really the intent. That's why they're not nailed to a cross. They are tied hanging upside down, and they're actually okay with being on the tree. And that's an idea that comes up repeatedly in all of my reading, is that importance of the acceptance of that situation.
They look serene a lot of times. They don't
look right, because it's a willing sacrifice for a longer term goal. The Slow Tarot is really interesting. They're held up by spider webs, which is kind of odd. But then I don't know if you can see it on here, but he's actually doing that game. I don't know if you remember this from when you were kids, but we'd tie yarn in circles, and then we would like weave and make things with them. Huh?
Yeah, the cat's cradle.
Yes, and so he's doing that. I included this one because there's something that bugs me about most hanged men, and that is that they tend not to portray the clothing as though gravity is working. So, like, to me, it always looks like gravity's not working. The gravity only seems to ever work on the hair. So you'll either find one of two things. Either they just totally overlook the gravity, or they put them in skin-tight clothes that, don't fall. But in the Golden Girls Tarot, his toupee is flopping down, and that was just
I love that.
And you actually also see, though his pants are kind of tight, they're actually cuffed at the bottom, I think. His sweater kind of falls below his belt where it's come untucked. But and so that's important to me. Like, she did a really great job in The Pocket of Peers. She's actually doing a handstand against the tree, going to that idea that this is a willing thing that we do. And this is something that I tried to practice this week as I worked with this card, was to put myself upside down. although I can't do that way. I mean, I was more like an angle on my couch with my feet in the air, to try to get my blood flowing to my head, encourage some thought and different perspective there. We've seen this in the light seers, but here's another one where there's that whole ribbon hanging idea over the water. And that's even in the Lost Hollow, which is a Thoth-based deck. But I love that they put the halo on there. And this one actually is the person hanging below the water. So the water being very important in it.
The Japaridze card is in water, and it's actually called the Drowned.
Okay.
So they're completely suspended in the water, they're unconscious.
Okay, yeah. So the Sassurabito actually describes the contentment on this person's face, and I find myself having to do this every time I see a hanged man. I have to turn it this way to actually look at him and see their facial expression and stuff. And he does actually look serene and content and everything. But to me, when I look at this card, it's very depressing. I think it's like the raindrop thingies in the background and the gray underwear. It just, to me, seems kind of depressing, though she talks about it being a very content and serene situation. In the Minoan Tarot, my friend Laura Perry actually went with the idea of sacrifice. So there's literally a cow on the table. So the idea that we give something to gain something in the future in some way. And there's an idea that she talks about in her guidebook that I'm going to share later. When I talk about this card in relations to other cards. Did you have any more cards that you wanted to share with us?
I did. I think there were some that were interesting. Now, this is the Mystical Cats Tarot, and this one is called the Floating Cat. And the cat's floating in the air, kind of defying gravity, but will land on his feet. And I love this deck. I think it's just a clever deck.
I like that. I like what you said about them landing on their feet. And that's an important aspect of this card, is that the person knows that the final outcome is for the greatest good, or is going to work out in the long run. And so the idea of the cat falling and always landing on their feet is great. Yeah.
I just love the Hangman. It's so interesting because if it's upright, then it's reversed. And so there's always this kind of, now this is the Edgar Allan Poe Tarot, and this is an image from The Pit and the Pendulum, where he is trapped. He's tied up and waiting for the pendulum to come down. But what he does is he puts little pieces of meat that they give him under the ropes so that the mice will eat through the ropes and he can escape. And so it's this idea of just waiting for the right moment and having to be patient and knowing that you can't do something right now. You just have to wait for the right moment for it to all work out. That some things are not in your control.
And that's an idea that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, is that idea of control. This is a more modern approach. The person's not actually hanging upside down. They're just laying on the bed that way. And so we get the idea that they're upside down. And it's a little odd to me because they just put a tree on one of the pillowcases, like you would have two different pillowcases. I don't know. But the tree is there to symbolize the tree. This is basically what I was doing all week, trying to work with this card in the Rider-Waite here. We see them on the couch, upside down, and you'll see other imagery that's important in the photographs in the back, like the tree and that type of thing. I really love this deck. The cardstock's really great too. It's just really cool. Yeah. So those were a lot of cards. There's some cards that when I go through my collection, they're all to me interesting and they give me something to really think about. And then other cards, it's like every deck has the same image.
Yeah. Some cards just don't deviate. It's almost like the creator didn't really know what to do with it. And so it's the same old, same old. And when I think that it's not the cutest card. I don't know. It's not one of those cards that can be impressive, like the Death card or the High Priestess, where it can be beautiful. It's just one of those, I really like when it's a surprise in the Hanged Man, because so often it's not a surprise. It's just the same image that you've seen a million times before.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because when I was reading about the Thoth image, one of the things that was mentioned is that, Crowley didn't think the hangman even needed to be in the tarot anymore, because it's an outdated idea that doesn't exist in the current ion, which is not an idea that I can talk about in any specificity because I haven't studied it that in depthly, but he didn't even really spend much time on it because he didn't think it belonged in the deck anymore, because we're not living in it.
What was an outdated idea?
Yeah.
What
And I think that's because he was looking at it from the Christian perspective, like the idea of Christ's sacrifice, which is coming into play this time of year. It's interesting this card landed on this week, because people tend to associate this card with the crucifixion of Jesus, whether they are Christian or not, because it's just how this card comes across to so many. It's an iconic kind of image that we've seen over and over throughout the years. But it's a similar idea here, right? That someone does something intentionally, willingly, for the greater good. So, and I think that's why that image has always been used that way.
Did you cut out, or was that just me?
Oh, I don't. I stopped talking for a second.
No, it spun around, but we're back, so that's fine.
Okay. It could be my connection or your connection or anything, but that's cool. So this card I actually studied a few months ago because I'm doing this cube of space study that goes through the Hebrew alphabets, which means I'm going through all of the major arcana. And I actually had to write a meditation for that class on Mem, which is the letter associated with this card. And that letter means water, but not like, okay, I'm going to pour a glass of water. It's more like the substance of creation, i.e. connected to amniotic fluid, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and we often get this idea of the association of birth with this card, not just because of that, but because of his position, right? Head coming down versus head up, the way babies exit the womb. And so there's this idea that this is also a card about pregnancy in some readings. Have you come across that in your reading?
I have, and just the idea of the being corded or having to cut the cord, because that the hangman is tied from, and also the idea of rebirth. This is the Mott Tarot, and it's associated with Lugnasa. And so there's this idea of having to sacrifice the king in order, like long live the king, and the death and rebirth of the king, and having to sacrifice some of the harvest so that you can plant the harvest. And so this is probably the most unique hanged man that I have.
So in that sense, and in that context, the cord, the tying of the person to the tree actually kind of makes sense to me. But then, the whole idea that I kept coming across from Waite to everybody else I read was that this was a willing sacrifice, or we did this willingly to gain enlightenment. I thought to myself, then why would they be tied, right? Because if they're doing this willingly, like, why aren't they just hanging their foot over their leg over the wood or something?
Which is what the Robin Hood deck has. They're just kind of hanging on with their knee.
Right, and that's what I ended up doing, because this actually is a specific scene from my life, which I try to do in these cards, which is why I added something to it that isn't traditionally in the Hanged Man. So this card is associated with Neptune, so there's that water again. That and Neptune, the planet, is actually associated with again enlightenment or spiritual growth or even psychic ability. And so, one of the ideas that I came up that I've never really thought about with this card was the idea that it represents prophecy, which relates to Neptune, because this person, even though no one else agrees with them at this place, they're in this position because they're in the minority. They know that they're in the right, and they are in the right. Hence, that halo, the divine presence with them, because they are in the right. In this situation where everyone else is in disagreement with them, and so um, that was an interesting idea that I'd never thought of before or worked with before, the idea of prophecy being associated with that.
Yeah, I read some things about Odin and him hanging. He had to give up his eye, and so then he could see and prophesize. And there was also something about um, the son of Poseidon, who once you caught him, so he couldn't shapeshift, he could prophesize. And there was an idea of this being soul retrieval or meditation, or that connection to the divine, and acknowledging that connection. And so it was all related to seeing into the future, or to trusting the messages that you are getting, and just having that knowledge that you have the understanding and the guidance.
Right. And I actually have seen that card, I think, online, that Dancing Soul Sister
Yeah.
mentions, the ancestral path, where the baby is actually in the womb upside down. Um, I think it's a great image. Yeah, so every book that I read mentioned Odin and the tree of Yggdrasil and hanging from it, and gaining wisdom and knowledge, which is what the tree supposedly represents, that continuing growth of knowledge. And so that's why in Waite's deck, it was a living tree. There's actually leaves growing from it and that kind of thing. But not all decks actually depict it that way. Some of them actually just use wood boards or beams, or in the Marseille, the trees specifically have had their limbs all removed, which kind of is something that can alter your perspective a little bit. I think seeing the living tree versus seeing a dead tree that someone's been hung on, like a gallows, it gives a very different feeling.
I did read some things about it being connected to punishment or shame, either punishing yourself or being punished,
Yes.
but not being sentenced to death.
There is this idea, and I don't know if I have that bookmarked, but there is a specific type of painting that was done. Oh, here it is. In Terra No Questions Asked, by Teresa Reed. She mentions it, and several other people mention it, but it's called Pittura Infamante, where they like punish people by depicting them in degrading ways in paintings for something they've done. So like they have, and there's, in that way, there's this idea that the hangman is associated with those who are true to themselves despite what everyone around them thinks. And then again, it goes back to, well, because ultimately they are right, that they are doing the right thing at this time in this place. And
well, I think
totally surrendering to it, as she says here.
I think that's so interesting in the run of cards that is justice sometimes, or strength, and then the Hangman, and then Death, because you have the Justice card, and then that sitting with it, and then the Death card is that transformation. So I just like how those connect together.
And it's interesting that you said that, because I was segueing into that, is how does your understanding of the Hangman change if it's strength versus justice? So to me, my immediate thought was, okay, if it's justice, then okay, we we have been evaluated, right? And we know where we're at, and now we are in a position of being um punished for it, or learning from it, so to speak, before we're transformed. And in her book, Teresa Reed actually said, sometimes if this comes up in a reading about a legal situation, which I would never read about, she's like, I feel like it's going to involve some jail time, because they're going to need some time to gain new perspective, right? And so I thought that was interesting, even though I tend to try, now that I've read through all of these books, not to think of the card in a punishment kind of way. So, but then if it's strength, um, and are you being so for me, for justice, it seems like it's a introspective thing to look back at how you've evaluated your life. But if it's strength, then is it punishment for being too lustful, for being too passionate, or how might that differ for you?
I don't remember which book I had that was talking about strength, um, the strength card, but to me, justice is 11. So um, I haven't really given the whole strength connection too much thought. For me, the strength card is more of an inner strength and taming that beast, but not through brute force, just through, killing it with kindness. And I don't know how that would connect. That doesn't really compute for me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've evaluated it several times from different perspectives, and I do think that justice belongs there. One of the things that Rachel Pollack talks about is, and this is one of the confusing things when I was reading the books, is people's numerology is very different. So,
Mhm.
like in this book, when they talk about numerology or the numbers, they look at the Hangman as a two because it's 12, 1, 2. But then most other books will look at it as three, because 1 plus 2 is 3. And so they would relate it to the world and to the Empress,
Right.
and those energies. And that's kind of how I went. But then, and then in this one, it relates it to the High Priestess.
Mhm.
And so I begin to think, well, does it really matter? Because every tarot card relates to every other tarot card
Yeah.
in some way. And
I
so,
read one is magician and two is high priestess, so it's related to both, and then to the empress, and then to the world because the world is 21 and that's 12,
right.
and also related to the world because of the similar posture. It's just that the world is upright and this is
Yes.
upside down. And then I kind of thought, well, it looks sort of like the fool too, because the fool and the world look similar. And so it was this beginning, middle, end. It just fits nicely and neatly. And then if you have 3 rows, it falls between the Hierophant and the Sun, which is more, mundane world and spiritual world. And so it's just nice, neat, tidy little package for me. But
Sure.
a lot of information, a lot.
You're right. And Rachel Pollack actually talks about it being in the middle. And because she says that there's not actually one card, right? It's actually a series of cards that are in the
Yeah.
middle. So she says it's the wheel, justice, and the hangman that is the center of the journey. Those three combined, as the middle there. I never really think of the tarot in terms of two sets of cards, like, there being a middle, because I always think of it as being divided into threes, a septenary of 7 cards and 7 cards and 7 cards that speak to your relationship to you know yourself, the world, and the divine. And so um I I don't know that it really matters. I think it does kind of influence your reading of the card a little bit, how you see the structure of the tarot. Whether is it okay? So this is halfway your great work that you're doing, or your goal in the world, or is this actually just a card along the way?
I think it's both, because I think we have a big journey and then a lot of little journeys along the way.
Right. Right.
Yes, hanging upside down requires total surrender, which is why it's a handstand is a scary yoga pose. I'm too scared, so I just do the legs up the wall and things like that.
Right. And there was some talk about yoga as well, and how people talk about the positioning. And we'll look at the positioning when I show my card in a while. I'm going to show the world with it. Yeah, so one of the things that I like to do is talk about all the images in the car in the original version of the Smith Way. So this was my coloring, and I basically stuck with the original coloring. I did do the shoes blue rather than yellow, but one of the things that came up is that the pants were red, because even though this is associated with water, that there is a level of fire energy.
Mm-hmm.
And where that comes in is Kabbalistically, fire being associated with the top of the tree of life and connected with that divine, so to speak. It is the energy that's coming in here. This is about your spiritual self. Is why they're red. But the halo is something I found after doing all of this study is important for me, because I want to remember that this person is in the right. They're not, they're not a criminal or anything, which is why it bugs me a little bit that Benebell Wynn renamed hers the Outlaw, rather than the Hanged Man. But I kept seeing it referred to as a nimbus, which is not something I'd ever heard before.
The halo? Yeah, I haven't either.
And so I looked up the word nimbus, because everybody used it in all of their books. And nimbus means, a cloud or halo around an object or person. And I'm like, okay, so why not just say halo? But anyway.
Well, is there a nimbus cloud that's like
yes,
a halo?
Yes.
Okay.
In that sense, I'd heard of it, but yeah, that's so that was a little weird for me. But I now know what it means, though I still am going to call it a halo. So the halo is that enlightenment. The tree we talked about as the knowledge. Let's talk about the legs in the original form. There's a lot of discussion of this shape, and we talked a little bit about how some people see it as yoga.
Mm-hmm.
And some people look at it and say it's a 4. It is about the 4 corners of the world, which the card is often connected to, the world card. And then others said, well, they're making the alchemical sign for water, because this card is the elemental card of water. Did you come across any other thoughts about that?
In the Robin Wood deck, when she has her, his leg is hanging over the limb, and then it forms this triangle, and she said that is the symbol for fire, that triangle. And so she did talk about that, and then also the number 4 connected to the Emperor. And one of the things Mary K. Greer spoke about in her deep dive into the Emperor, which was at StarCon a couple years ago, was she said, how is the Hanged Man the opposite of everything the king represents? And so there was this she said is inner rather than outer, or anti-establishment. And then she talked about 2020 being the year of the emperor because it's a 4, and then it's contrasted with this struggling and the pandemic. So it was supposed to be this, very stable year, and it was the complete upside down of that, which I thought was interesting.
Right, right. I had come across those thoughts as well. So I wanted to talk about the Tower and the Hanged Man. In her book for the Minoan Tarot, Laura Perry talks about how the Hanged Man is about giving in to change willingly, and whereas the Tower is we're fighting against that change, right? So this is change we don't want versus change we do want. And I kind of like that because the Tower is associated with fire, and this card's associated with water. So them being opposites kind of really connected for me in that way. And it's that idea that we are giving up control in the Hanged Man versus in the Tower. We want control of things, and so it takes us off guard that when they're changing like that.
I like that, and I think I did read something about, if you don't do this willingly, then the universe kind of does this for you, which, I think sometimes the tarot can let us know you can do it this way, or it can be a more difficult way, but either way, this is happening. So, maybe sometimes if you get the Hanged Man, if you pay attention, you can avoid the Tower sometimes, not all the time.
Right. So let's talk about some keywords. So obviously, suspension keeps coming up in our chat. Surrender, letting go, and things we've talked about. We talked about self-sacrifice, a change of perspective. But something that came up repeatedly in my reading, and I never really thought about, was the idea of waiting. Of just being, right? And discernment, like where that prophecy idea that we talked about earlier, rather than waiting, but the calm before the storm. So like, because this is right before death, this is like a moment of reflection before the transition and transformation. And another idea that kept coming,
I have come across that too, that idea of it seems like nothing's happening, but really there might be forces at play that we don't see. It doesn't look like a lot of action, but really it's action.
You're describing the last 3 months of my life. So let's hope that this week pulling the Hanged Man is the end to that, and it's about to reveal itself, whatever it is. Yes, but another idea that keeps coming up is that this is like a gift of self, like being your best yourself in the world, regardless of the consequences, which we talked a little bit about. And let's talk about the shadow side of it, that upside down. Like what kinds of keywords might you associate with it?
Resistance. It's like one of those finger traps where the more you wiggle, the tighter it gets. And, trying to force things, I might say, forcing the issue, or just being really, really stuck and stagnant.
Yeah, that's definitely something that came up when I was doing my reading, was that idea of blockage, of indecision, of being stuck. Also the idea of being persecuted or martyrdom, which relates to that idea of prophecy, i.e. if you're a false prophet or you have a false spirituality going on, then you may find yourself being persecuted or being the martyr in the sense that you're wrong, right? So this way, hanging upside down is right, but this side is the standing upright is wrong. So which is interesting. Most cards it would be the opposite, but the hangman is everything is just completely topsy turvy, right?
Yes.
So this idea of patience while we reach enlightenment, I think comes up a lot for me in the reading of this card over and over again. And I feel like that's kind of where I'm moving towards in my life, because I find a lot of times when I'm working with these cards, they're relating to things that are already going on.
Mhm.
I would not have made that tower connection when I read it in the guidebook if it weren't that this is actually the week that I'm studying the letter P, which is associated with the tower, for my cube of space. And so it really correlated for me in a strong way because I was working on that as well. Um, and so I'm almost afraid of what card's going to come up next, right? Since I'm pulling them at random, that happens. So, do you have any other thoughts that you want to make sure that you share today?
Well,
Or
I think not the tower. I do like your tower connection, though. I jotted down some notes. But the Hanged Man can be really positive because something else that I need to work on is the idea of trusting that you are in the place where you are supposed to be right now. And that, I question that a lot. I'm supposed to be doing this. I'm supposed to be a lot further along. I should, and just being a human being and not a human doing, and trusting that this is a sacred place too. I don't have to reach the end goal today.
oh goodness, I've got to remember to write that down afterwards. Human being, not human doing. I've heard it before, but I just need to write it in my notes today, my journal today, so that I think about it this week. Maybe I'll add it to my little talisman that I created. Um, wow. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, okay. Let's take a look at the card that I created. Talk a little bit about it, and I did want to show some other things related to it as well. So this is the card that I ended up creating, and this is the idea that I've had for the Hangman for a long time. It does resemble some other cards that are out there, but this is actually, like many of the cards in my deck, autobiographical. It's a scene from my life, and I was really surprised that I was able to pull the images together to make it just perfect. It is exactly what I was hoping it would be. um, there is the tree, of course, from which the person is hanging. For me, that halo idea is important. I also added the butterfly, which in my deck, in the Fool, represents the presence of the divine with you. For me, growing up, I spent a lot of time alone, and to this day, I end up being alone a lot. And so I always
Yeah.
seek out places that are pretty and relaxing, and the river was always that space for me. And there was a tree that hung over the river, and I used to like to go and sit on it and watch the fish swimming, and kind of gain new perspective on life and being alone versus being with people who were not nice to me all the time. Um, and sometimes I would actually hang upside down, with my knees over the limb, and so that was the image that I wanted to create for myself and for this card. But I did intentionally work to connect it with other cards in the deck. The water being a very important aspect, I immediately grabbed the same image I used when I created the chariot to bring in the water and make that connection. And then I use the same grass and cattails and whatnot from the moon card, because this is, in a way, connected to the moon in that it is also related to water. And just as this one is related to water. And so connecting it with those was important in a way to me. But the other thing I did to bring in that little bit of fire that Robin Wood mentioned and that some others have mentioned in some of the cards was the background is actually from the Four of Wands. And the Four of Wands was originally one of my favorite cards that I had done up until that time. And then I fell in love with my Chariot. And now I think that the Hanged Man is probably my favorite. My only problem with the Hanged Man is I do have to clean up some lines, but you can't really see the number on it, which isn't vital for me or important. But uh, because the leaves are so busy, it is kind of hard to see that.
I
Yeah.
love it because it just captures that it's a choice, that it's not a punishment, that, this person's willing to be there, and it's not even something that is unpleasant. And it's pretty. And there are so few pretty Hanged Men cards. Yeah, a joyful Hanged Man, Dancing Soul Sister says.
So, one other thing I'd like to show and look at is we talked about this briefly, but the connection of the hangman to the world. And we see that a little bit in my deck where you've got a dancer here making that 4. And then here we're also making that 4. Now, what you may or may not have realized yet is that this is also a dancer. The Hanged One actually started out as a ballerina that I edited to not have a tutu. And so the idea that in this card it's a more active energy, a more have truly found yourself kind of energy, and in the Hanged Man there's still this kind of calm that comes from ballet versus say like a modern dance or jazz or something like that. But and so I tried to connect them that way. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. I probably will eventually go back and make all of the purples the same purple in my deck. But because this ballerina was already purple, I didn't change her color in my initial draft of it.
I love that.
So we are at card 37 next week. So I need to draw there we go. Draw for next week to see what our card's going to be. And if anybody out there wants to join me, as Amy did, and talk about your favorite cards and the meanings of the cards and get to know a specific card this week to share with others, please do let me know. Some of you are making some great comments today on the Hangman, and I think you would be great to have in person and talk about some cards, right? So,
yes.
Oh, I like that. There we go. Life is a dance. Yeah, there we go. All right. Oops. Drum roll, please. Oh my God.
What is it?
Oh, I'm so excited. Okay. I'm not sure what this card is going to look like when I finish it, but I am excited to do this card in it, and I couldn't be more thrilled that it came up instead of something dreadful. But but it is the Star. This is one of those cards for me. Always has to be right in a deck, and so a little bit intimidated because I want to make sure mine is correct and looks right in my deck. But yeah, so it's the Star, that card of healing and hope that's associated with Aquarius, and with air, which I'm a Libra, so air in my, as you are as well. So if you want to talk about the Star next week, it is your week to do it. So just message me on Instagram or Facebook. Don't forget to check out the Facebook group, Good Journeys into Tarot, to see the cards before anybody else and give your opinions and ideas. Tarot Stash has contributed, and Ange from Tiny Trinkets and Tarot have contributed to some of the ideas and some of the cards. And I've even made some updates based on comments that Amy has made in my lives. And that's why I'm doing this, because I like to have people's input. And that's one of the things that's really surprised me. Maybe it's the size of my audience, but I very rarely get any critique or criticism on any social media of the things that I'm doing. And I really would love your feedback. If you go to my website, goodjourneystarot.com, you can sign up for my newsletter and find out everything else that's going on with me, and all of the different ways that you can communicate with me. Want to thank Amy so much for being here. Do you have anything coming up on your channel that you want to share with us?
I do have a glow in the dark video, so that will be coming up soon. I'm not sure how, if I can finagle it. We'll see how logistically that works out.
All right. And Amy will be joining me sometime in June with Tarot Stash himself to talk about the Robin Wood Tarot. They've been using it for years and love it. And I have just purchased it, and I read with it for 1 week so far.
My granddaughter.
They convinced me to give it a try. Now I'm going to have them on and convince me that some of these cards aren't just off. It's not just me. But yeah, so looking forward to that discussion about the Robin Wood coming up in the future. So thank you everyone for being here. Until we meet again, good journeys.
Bye.